Hello, friend. Thank you so much for downloading this podcast of a previous program of In the Market with Janet Parshall. I do hope with all my heart that you hear something that encourages, equips, enlightens, and engages you to the point where you're just going to be overflowing with the love of the Lord, and you're anxious to get out into that marketplace of ideas and to let your light so shine. But before you do, may I take just a moment and tell you about this month's Truth Tool? If you listen to our program with any regularity, you know we're rather passionate about sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's why we go into the marketplace of ideas in the first place. So I've chosen the book, How to Revive Evangelism by Craig Springer. This is an extremely important book that reminds us that evangelism is crucial today like it's never been before. But we are in a post-everything era. We live in a post-Christian, post-modern, post-truth world where the evangelism approaches of the past are increasingly ineffective. We don't ever want to change the message, but I think we are being compelled to change the method. How do we do that? This book is designed to encourage you to do just that. It starts, of course, with the presupposition that you and I are going to be obedient to God, and we're going to go and tell His good news. We are the fractured earthen vessels that get to carry this imperishable message, but go we must. And we have a myriad of reasons why we're reticent to do that. Well, we've got to get past all of those reasons for the sake of those who might spend eternity separated from God. We just need to learn better methods. That's why I want to encourage you to get How to Revive Evangelism as this month's Truth Tool. We are, in fact, listener-supported radio. The book, on one hand, is immaterial. It's my way of saying thank you. So that's what makes it material. I want to tangibly show you how much I care for you and how much I care for your growth in Christ. But I also want to show you in a very concrete way how much I appreciate the financial support you're affording this program. We have practical needs. Your financial gifts meet those needs. So you can get a copy of How to Revive Evangelism by calling 877-JANET-58. That's 877-JANET-58. Or you can go to inthemarketwithjanetparshall.org. Scroll to the bottom of the page. There's the cover of the book. Click it on, give a gift of any amount, and I will send you a copy of How to Revive Evangelism. By the way, when you're on the website, look what it means to be a partial partner. Those are our dear friends who give every single month at a level of their own choosing, and the website explains how I say thank you to my partial partners. So again, this month's Truth Tool, How to Revive Evangelism. Let's go and let's tell. And now I hope you hear something that will, in fact, encourage you to do just that on this podcast. Thanks for listening.
Hey there, I'm Jamin Baxter, and I serve Moody Radio as the Director of Business Development. Our team's job is to find businesses that love Moody Radio and Jesus Christ and want to support the work we do financially, just like you. Today, I'd like to introduce you to United Faith Mortgage. Simply put, they are a faith-focused mortgage team serving clients across the United States. They've put together a team with Christian values with faith and family at the core. They know that this is arguably the most important purchase of your life. Check out the top 5 things you should know about United Faith Mortgage at UnitedFaithMortgage.com. Thanks to you and United Faith Mortgage for supporting Moody Radio.
United Faith Mortgage is a DBA of United Mortgage Corp., 25 Melville Park Road, Melville, New York. Licensed mortgage banker. For all licensing information, go to nmlsconsumeraccess.org. Corporate NMLS number 1330. Equal housing lender. Not licensed in Alaska, Hawaii, Georgia, Massachusetts, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Utah.
Here are some of the news headlines we're watching.
By the time the conference was over, the president won a pledge.
So Americans worshiping government over God.
An extremely rare safety move by a nation.
17 years the Palestinians and Israelis negotiated.
We hear a lot of
Hi, friends. Welcome to In the Market with Janet Parshall. Thrilled we're going to spend the hour together. Lots of conversation about a wide variety of topics. But first, in the world of sports, let me give you an update. Wow, have you been watching Simone Biles? She was precious to watch the last go-around, and I think a whole lot of us were cheering her on this go-around as well. But it all came to an end tonight in Tokyo. She came as a star of the U.S. Olympic movement and perhaps the games themselves. It all ended today because she did a wonky vault. To start her competition, she sort of huddled with the U.S. team doctor before heading backstage for a few minutes. When she came out, she hugged her teammate. She took off her bar grip. She put on a sweatsuit. And basically she said, gotta go. Medical issues. Boom, that's it. Day was over. A short time later, despite a valiant effort from 3 other members of the U.S. team, They got passed. They got passed by the Russians. The team representing the Russian Olympic Committee surged past the U.S. to gold, posting 169.528 to capture the country's first Olympic title since Barcelona in 1992. So that breaks a lot of our hearts. Hey, you want some more Olympic news? I'll give you one. This story was reported back in May, so I'm not quite sure because I actually didn't follow this to the very bitter end. But I thought you'd like to know, as long as this is a set of games that apparently are making world history. First, nobody's watching them. Second, nobody's there. So they're not watching on TV. People aren't paying attention. They're not in the stands. It started out with protests. And for the first time, by the way, you have a record number of trans athletes that are also competing. At least 9 were hoping to earn a spot in Tokyo. And that's very interesting. If you look at some of the people, one of them obviously has already qualified. A man who now calls himself Laurel Hubbard, a weightlifter. Just let that sink in for a minute. So he decided that he would transition from a man to a woman later in life as an adult, which meant all that stuff that he got as a teenager growing, that muscle mass, that lung strength, that's all there. And now you go to a sport that is absolutely predicated on the concept of strength. And this man who now calls himself Laura is now a qualifier for New Zealand for the Olympics. It's going to be real interesting. By the way, there's also someone who's trying to get on the Brazil volleyball team, a track and field player, Nikki Hiltz. Robin Lambert, an Australia Paralympic. There were a couple of Paralympians that were trying to get on as trans. There's a soccer player from Canada, and then there's another player for U.S. track and field. And, of course, there's an individual who's been named as an alternative for the BMX. Yes, sports fans, there is now BMX competition at the Olympics along with badminton. No editorial comments. So there you go. Now you've got all of these record-setting numbers for trans athletes. If you're also counting, because you might be, I don't know, you might find this interesting, but there are a record number of LGBTQ athletes at the Olympics. 100 publicly outed LGBTQ athletes at the Olympics as well. Why is that important? Because that's where we're going to start in our conversation this hour. You know, fair is fair. It's the thrill of victory, the agony of defeat. You're going for the gold, the silver, or the bronze. And you presume when you go and you compete that it's going to be fair, that the one who has the best strength, is the fastest, can shoot the straightest, can throw as many basketball hoops as they possibly can, that athletic prowess is going to be the only thing that separates the gold from the bronze from the silver. No. Now we've, in this post-truth world of ours, we've decided that we would radically redefine everything, including, so now if a boy decides that he wants to identify as a girl and he's on the high school track team and he decides he's going to compete, Susie doesn't have a chance. Because the boy who's decided to identify as a girl and therefore is now going to run on the girls' team already has a physiological advantage. As I said before, muscle mass, lung strength, bone density, the list goes on. Follow the science. I found it interesting in a recent march down Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C., along with wearing different animal hats, a lot of the attendees carried a sign that said, follow the science. Okay, I'm following the science here. You can decide that you want to be a boy, but you're still a girl. You can decide that you want to be a girl, but you were born a boy. You're still a boy. All of this great transcendent thinking was filtered out for me by simply working with Batman. Batman is not a bat. He is a man in a bat suit. So he can call himself Batman, but he is still a man in a bat suit. And I don't mean to minimize that because I know that there are people who need psychological support, that this is an area where people are struggling. There are profound causal factors on this. But I am stupefied that what we turn around is rather than giving the people the real, true, necessary help that they need, we accommodate lickety-split, and we give particularly teenagers and preteens hormones and say, don't tell your mom, don't tell your dad, says Planned Parenthood, whose new cash cow, by the way, happens to be the dispensation of these particular drugs. So I'm getting ahead of myself because I want to know what the states are doing. This is a major problem because, quite frankly, speaking of sports, sorry, but the Supreme Court dropped the ball on this one. Flag on the field, 15-yard penalty, roughing the player, okay? They did not get this cleared up the way that they should have, so now we still have a fruit basket upset. We're going to talk with Sarah Parshall-Perry. If that middle name sticks out, it's on purpose because her daddy and I gave it to her. She's a legal fellow at the Institute for Constitutional Government at the Heritage Foundation. Before that, she was a former senior counsel to the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Ed, which works out well because all this stuff about girls and boys playing on each other's teams goes right to the core of the Department of Education. Sarah, the warmest of welcomes. I want to do a flyover first. I'm glad you're with me. Talk to me about, I made a declaration. You're the lawyer. The Supreme Court did drop the ball. Why didn't they give us clarification? Instead, dancing a hoedown, Gorsuch sidestepped this one tremendously and basically said, not going to touch it. Is it because they knew bigger, more important cases would be coming down the road apiece, or it was, once again, a legal hot potato and they didn't want to touch it?
Well, I think they haven't yet seen the precise conflict that's going to help clarify Title IX. And the decision that you're referring to, Bostock versus Clayton County, if you remember, is last year's big Supreme Court decision saying that they were going to expand the definition of sex in employment law to include sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, we know that that interpretation way overbroadens the true legal meaning of the term sex, but what Gorsuch did say was, we are not addressing bathrooms and sports. We're going to leave that for another day until we have the fact right in front of us. And so because they have failed to find that yet, they're going to put it on pause until the right conflict appears for them.
And in the meantime, chaos ensues. Wow. We've got a lot to talk about. Sarah Parshall-Perry is with me this hour. We're going to linger with this idea of girls and boys on the playing field, what states are doing in response, what protections are going to be needed, and what's happening in particular to Christian schools. Back after this. Half of all Christians in the U.S. have 2 or fewer spiritual conversations a year with non-Christians. We're failing to obey the Great Commission. That's why I've chosen How to Revive Evangelism as this month's Truth Tool. Learn a compelling way to share your faith about Jesus. How to Revive Evangelism is yours when you give a gift of any amount to In the Market. Call 877-JANET-58, 877-JANET-58, or go to inthemarketwithjanetparshall.org. We're visiting with Sarah Parshall-Perry, who happens to be a legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. She's the former senior counsel to the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education. And we're starting our conversation, particularly in light of the Olympics as they're taking place right now. This is a very germane topic. What in the world is happening to athletics now for kids, for girls in particular? You know, there's an entire movement in this country now called Save Women's Sports, because this really is an issue of fairness. When that gun goes off and everybody jumps off that starting block, they should be on a level playing field. That's the whole idea, and the best person wins, right? But you can't mix together people who have a physiological advantage and think that you've held true to the idea of absolute fairness. Sarah, I want to hit the pause button on this, because you and I can talk public policy until the cows come home. In fact, most of the time we're together, that's exactly what we do. But I want to hit the pause button, and I want to ask you, as a Christian, why should we care about these issues?
Well, you and I both know that there is only one truth, and that is God's truth. And God has created us male and female, biologically separated, only 2 sexes, and that whatever we believe to be true about ourselves does not change who we are and who God created us to be. We know that these issues are important. We know, as you mentioned early on in the beginning of the program, that a lot of these individuals have concurrent mental health diagnoses. In fact, there's some statistics that say even up to 30% may have autism. So we understand that these are individuals who are hurting. So from a care standpoint, we want to be able to provide them support, but we are not asked to give in to whatever their subjective belief is about their own identity. God does not require that of us.
Yeah, I agree. You know, when someone's struggling with their self-concept, with their decision-making, when that organ known as the mind is troubled, I think we have to be very judicious to say we understand that the decision-making capabilities here are somehow being compromised. So we want to be cautious, we want to be thorough, and we want to be compassionate. You know, when someone says, I want to take my own life, what compassionate person says, here, let me provide you with the poison? I mean, that's ludicrous. And yet there's a hurting person here, and we can't run fast enough to speak into this the skewed, broken self-concept. So I just wanted to say that because people are going, man, what do I care? I'm a Christian. What does this have to do? It has to do with caring for people. It has to do with what's going on outside our world, where good is called evil, evil is called good, and people are quite literally before our very eyes doing what is right in their own eyes. So we need to care as compassionate people. That's part of seeking the welfare of the city, Jeremiah said in his letter to the captives. So let me go back to this idea again. So the question didn't get answered. It was left wide open. It's created cultural chaos in the interim. And so states have necessarily stepped up and said, we're going to try to make a decision in our own state. But Sarah, what bothers me here is that the weapon of choice for the change agents who want this stuff out there is hit them in their pocketbook. So if you threaten economically, it's what we saw with the governor in South Dakota. It's what we're seeing in Arkansas with Governor Asa Hutchinson. If there's an economic threat to the state, even though the will of the people has been manifest through the state legislature and they say, yep, we want to put a prohibition in place. Girls compete against girls, boys against boys. We're not going to dispense these drugs pell-mell. Out of compassion and concern and care, we're not going to do it. And then boom. A governor overrides because a big corporation comes along and says, you do that, we won't let our ball games be played there, or we're going to move our international corporation out of your state. I got to tell you, Sarah, money doesn't shout, it screams in this case. So talk to me about what just happened in Louisiana.
Well, that's actually a perfect example of what just happened in Louisiana. In fact, the Louisiana legislature was one of 31 state legislatures that have introduced bills specifically designed to protect biological competition. These are state versions of Title IX, which for years since its passage in 1972 meant that males and females were to be separated but given equal opportunity in athletics and in education. Well, these states are now having to fill in the gap because what's coming out of the Department of Education under the current administration is saying that we are expanding Title IX to include those who identify with being a particular sex. So Louisiana stepped up, the State House and the State House of Representatives and the State Senate both stepped up, passed a law that was a separation of women's sports. It was called the Protect Women's Sports Act. It went to Governor Edwards' desk. He is the only Democrat in the Deep South. He promptly vetoed the Fairness in Women's Sports Act, and when he did, he said, among other things, that the bill unfairly targeted transgender children, but more compellingly, I think here, that he didn't want the NCAA and various athletic championships like the Final Four to be taken out of Louisiana. So the pocketbook, as far as he was concerned, was more important than protecting biological girls and fairness in sports. So the Louisiana House and Senate took up a formal veto override process. The veto override vote passed in the Senate, but it was two heartbreakingly short votes shy in the House of Representatives. So unfortunately, girls in Louisiana are going to have to wait until the Supreme Court takes up a challenge until they are allowed sex-segregated athletics.
Wow. Now, let me pause because I started out by talking about the Olympics. And when you understand sports, you understand the intersection here. So these kids competing in high school sports, sometimes this is their passport to higher ed, and it comes by way of a sports scholarship. You don't get that sports scholarship if you come in third or fourth because you're beaten by a boy. So an opportunity for a girl through an academic or an athletic scholarship at an academic institution is taken away. It also, by the way, doesn't give that person the opportunity to advance in the sports world. Say they're so good that they can then become a professional, or they decide that they're going to go as far as you can in the amateur route. All of those doors get closed because at this starting level, Louisiana, if that door of equal opportunity is shut, that girl pays a price for it. Now, when we come back, you just wrote a piece recently for the Daily Signal, and I want our friends listening across the country to understand this isn't just a Louisiana issue. And I hearken to the fact that Arkansas has had this issue, South Dakota's had this issue. What are states doing generally? Do a flyover for us. How many states have introduced legislation? Are we seeing a pattern here where every time it works its way through the legislature, the governor vetoes again because of a corporate threat? I want to get a take on that. Sarah Parshall-Perry is with me. She is a legal fellow with the Heritage Foundation. If you've got thoughts, I'll open those phone lines at 877-548-3675. That's 877-548-3675. More after this. 877-548-3675. That's our number here on In the Market with Janet Parshall. And I'll tell you what, I am thrilled that I get to spend some time with Sarah Parshall Perry. Yep, she is indeed my daughter, in full disclosure. She's as smart as a whip, and I so appreciate her biblical worldview as she's working in the nation's capital to influence and occupy until he comes. So she takes up these very complex legal issues, including this issue as a legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation of women in sports, because this gets all, and you notice I'm staying away from terms like Title VII, Title IX, and occasionally we'll drop a title case in there. I want you to get the bigger picture. The bigger picture is that we've done this cultural shift that all started with taking a look at the Civil Rights Act that rightfully, necessarily was passed in 1964. And it created categories where you couldn't discriminate against people based on their, quote, immutable characteristic. That's a clumsy legal term that basically means unchangeable. And that's why the Supreme Court, with all due respect, has never given people with same-sex attraction that kind of protection, because every time you talk to someone who says such were some of 1 Corinthians, you realize it is a mutable characteristic. So therefore, it didn't meet the criteria of a protected class. Well, as the culture continues to decay in anticipation of Christ's glorious return, we have looked back now at the Civil Rights Act of 64 and said, oh, you know what? They were dunderheads. In 64, they didn't know what the word sex meant. Here's what it meant. It meant anything you want it to mean, including SOGI laws, sexual orientation, gender identity. So abracadabra, now 1964 means whatever we want it to be in a post-truth culture. And isn't it interesting? He who troubleth his own house inherits the wind. And there is a gale force wind blowing across our country right now as we try to figure out how to make sense of these ideas, which have bad consequences. And one of the consequences is that girls' sports is being irreparably damaged in our country. 877-548-3675, 877-548-3675. Sarah, I'm going to take some calls in a bit, but just do the flyover for me. It isn't just Arkansas. It isn't South Dakota. It isn't just Louisiana. Because of what happened in that clumsy decision that came down from the high court, Bostock, the door was left wide open to try to deal with Title IX, girls' sports. And so states have said, we're going to step up and we're going to do something. What's happening?
Well, 35 bills have been introduced in 31 states. That shows you a little bit of the popularity of this issue and the sort of urgency that a lot of these state houses are feeling to get something passed before the current administration changes any more regulations when it comes to education and the ability to compete in athletics. So the majority of these states, Tennessee, Arkansas, Alabama, Florida, West Virginia, Montana, and Idaho, they have all passed legislation. It is now on the books. Traditional interpretations of this Title IX, what we call the sports bill, is now in place. Their athletics will remain sex segregated, but there are a number of other states, everywhere from the Midwest to the Southeast, where there is currently legislation that is pending. Now, one of the states, very interesting, is North Carolina. If you remember, North Carolina made the news for something called HB2, which was known as the bathroom bill. That was that state's attempt to make sure that bathrooms remained sex segregated. They sort of felt the winds of change blowing. That law was ultimately repealed after very, very heavy political and cultural pressure. So you can see that it's possible to manipulate, in many cases, the outcome. Governors who have the opportunity to sign these laws into effect oftentimes face very intense criticism and mounting pressure to make sure that the economic bottom line is not affected. So what we really need is men and women of good character who are sitting in those executive offices to sign these laws into place.
Well, 877-548-3675. Sam, you're in Florida. Welcome to the conversation. Share your thoughts with us, please.
How you doing?
Good, thank you. Glad you're here.
I'm a coach in middle school Christian school, and I'm familiar with the Title IX program because I'm an athlete all my life. But at our school, we short the boys at our count, so we got more girls than boys. So what I do, I put the girls together to keep my program alive, our program alive in middle school. They play with the boys. And so I'm just saying this, I don't know, I'm not bragging, but we beat a team this year with all boys, and I asked the one kid after the game was over, counting the girls on your team and the boys on my team. I thought they had a girl in the team, but they didn't. And I got in trouble. They thought I was bragging because we beat them.
Sam, I love it. I love it. And I got to tell you, not a lot of people know this, but in fact, Title IX, the sports bill that we're talking about at the national level, allows co-ed teams. So a lot of people think, okay, we have to keep them sex segregated, but the law actually says, listen, you can open them up so that boys and girls can play together. And in fact, a lot of these state bills have actually included those provisions, reminding the states that, yes, you can make these teams co-ed, but if you separate them by sex, it has to be the biological sex of the player, not what they believe themselves to be.
So let me clarify that. And Sam, you sound like an absolutely great coach. I love the way you approach this. But you're saying, so let's say it's a soccer team, like Sam. So you're saying you could have a team made up of both boys and girls together, but they have to be boys who believe they're boys. Girls, they have to be girls, but they can play together on the same team, right?
Correct. There's nothing in the law preventing co-ed athletic teams in educational environments. But what the law does say now, particularly after we've seen a lot of these state bills, is if you separate the teams, if you have a girls' team and a boys' team, it has to be based on biological sex and not gender identity.
Thank you, Sam, for being a part of this. I greatly appreciate it. Let me take a break and come right back. Sarah Parshall-Perry is with me for the whole hour. She's a legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation, and she writes and talks and speaks on these issues all the time. And let me tell you, she's one busy person right now. I'm glad she's got the time to share her thoughts with us today. Back after this. If what you hear on In the Market with Janet Parshall encourages you, enlightens you, engages you, and equips you, I want to ask you to become a partial partner today. This program depends on the faithful and ongoing support of listeners just like you. By supporting this program on a regular, ongoing, monthly basis, you'll receive several benefits that only my partners receive. So please call today, 877-JANET58, or go online to inthemarketwithjanetparshall.org. We are visiting with Sarah Parshall-Perry, who is a legal fellow in the Institute for Constitutional Government at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. She's also former senior counsel to the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education. So she writes and speaks and blogs and tweets on these articles on a regular basis. And we're going to continue, if you so choose, to have you weigh in with your thoughts about this apple cart upset about girls and sports. But I want to go to another topic. But just before I do, Sarah, let me go back and clarify, because some people might be saying, wait, I don't get it. So if you decide to have a co-ed team, a soccer team, the only court requirement is that you have to say it's a boy who identifies as a boy and it's a girl who identifies as a girl. But somebody would say, well, doesn't that weaken your argument? I'm playing the devil's advocate, not that I ever take him as a client. But what if you were to say, I mean, if there were a physical advantage, whether he identifies as a boy or a girl or not, that physical advantage remains on the playing field. So how is that any different?
Well, biological sex is only relevant for purposes of Title IX, right, the sports law, when you separate teams into female teams and male teams. And quite frankly, you could make a co-ed team, because that's permitted under Title IX, with students who identify of either gender, because understanding that all of those particular kids would be playing together, there's no physical advantage. And that's sort of what Sam was talking about, in that, listen, they had the male strength and they also had the female players as well, so everyone enjoyed the same benefits. So ultimately, biological sex only matters when you separate the teams. If you don't separate the teams and they play on a co-ed basis, which is allowed under law, then they can all play together regardless of their biological sex or their gender identity. But a lot of people don't want to take that tact. A lot of liberals we're seeing do not want the option for co-ed teams. They want to play specifically with the team that matches what they believe they are. And that's truly what we have the greatest issue with. We love the concept of co-ed teams. We've offered it up in some sample legislation, but it's not sufficient for a lot of the complaints we're getting from the hard left, that they would much rather play according to their gender identity on that particular segregated team.
Well, and as moms and dads start thinking about the kids going back to school, remember the controversy doesn't end when the game's over, because now you've got the question of locker rooms and showers, and all of that gets bound up into this. So really, this is a very, very challenging issue. Nicole, I think you join us from Ohio with a very appropriate thought. We'd love to hear it.
Hi, yeah. When I played soccer in high school, we didn't have a separate girls and boys team. And I was the only girl on the soccer team. And let me tell you, the strength is very different. And the other thing is, people want to talk about we don't want to discriminate. Well, you know what? You're discriminating against women when you're going to let men who are biologically males be on the team. They are way stronger. And this is the other thing people need to think about. We want to talk about how steroids is unacceptable, right? And that's cheating. Well, guess what kids are doing when they're taking hormones?
Yep.
Those
Yep.
are steroids.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But we need to start talking about protecting. I was the only girl on the team. Guess what? I went to my own locker room. I had to be separated.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Same with, my children play hockey. The girls, when they play it on a boys team. They go to separate locker rooms. So do the referees.
Yeah. Yep.
And we need to think about also. You need to protect your girls and your boys.
Yeah.
Both.
Sarah, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, in fact, it's interesting that you bring that up because that is an argument that we have heard brought up over and over again, which is it's ultimately discriminatory for female athletics. And we know that among the chief proponents, the authors of the Education Amendments of 1972, they themselves have said, listen, we know it was motivated by discriminatory action against women, that there were unequal educational opportunities, there were unequal pay disparities in the workforce, multitudes. If you remember, obviously, after the sexual revolution, this was sort of the way the feminist movement was going. And the culmination of that, in many respects, was Title IX back in 1972. So, ironically, we're seeing feminism turned a bit on its head here. The same women who are arguing for equality are suspiciously silent in many respects now, which is something we find really sort of flummoxing. But you're absolutely right in that forcing someone who is taller, stronger, bigger lung capacity, denser muscle mass, stronger bones to compete against somebody who isn't, and that's just a biological reality, ultimately discriminates against that smaller or weaker individual. So truly, that is a point that I cannot stress enough, that ultimately you are taking an anti-discrimination law and actually making it become discriminatory against the very people it was designed to protect.
I want to pick up on something Nicole noted. She said that when she was playing on the soccer team, she went to the girls' locker room. When her daughters are playing on the hockey team, they go to the girls' locker room. This is another game changer that I want mom and dad to understand, that in light of these new SOGI laws, that's not going to happen. If in other words, the individual's identity supersedes common sense, decency, privacy, modesty. So if Johnny decides to identify as a girl, Johnny doesn't just get to compete against Susie for track and field. Johnny decided to call himself Susie, now gets to use the same locker room as the rest of the girls. Am I right? And by the way, that's part of this problem. And I want mom to understand, to say, well, maybe that's not such a problem on the playing field, but what happens when you go back to the locker room? Talk to me about this.
Well, that's a great point, because Title IX we all think of as the sports bill, but Title IX has another aspect, and that's as it relates to bathrooms and private facilities like locker rooms. That is another aspect that's covered by Title IX. So you see what the Education Department did when it sort of glibly said, we're going to include sexual orientation and gender identity. They didn't just change sports. They also changed locker rooms and hotel rooms and bathrooms and any private space you might encounter in the context of education in America. This is a huge change. So one of the things we're seeing now is a number of cases that the Supreme Court is ultimately going to get the opportunity to rule on. One of them was the Gavin Grimm case. Now, this was a biological female identifying as a male who wanted to use the male bathroom. Well, dishearteningly, I think for a lot of us, the Supreme Court kicked it back down to the trial Court level and said, this isn't the right case for us. We were hoping for clarity on Title IX, on the bathroom issue, but I think what they're waiting for is a conflict between the federal courts. They want one court that says Title IX means biological boys and girls, and another one that says Title IX means gender identity. If they have that type of a conflict, it's precisely what the Supreme Court likes to see before taking up an issue of this magnitude. They just haven't found that conflict yet.
Mary in Pennsylvania, welcome. Your question, please.
Hi. Thank you for taking the call. I just would like to know just exactly what is the difference between the idiocy, pardon the word, but it's complete illogical thinking, and what is the difference between what we're discussing and a boy in terms of identification, like self-identity, in terms of a boy identifying a 6'4" high school boy wrestler saying, I identify as a 4'10" wrestler, and I want to be in the lower weight class wrestling.
Yeah.
That is a great point. In fact, at a certain point, you realize that this kind of absurdist logic is going to get the leftists in trouble. How far do you take something as far as the flexibility of biological sex? So one day it's sex, the next day it could be height, the next day it could be even racial identity. And believe it or not, we're seeing that. And I know that you've actually talked about that on your show, about the British man who has suddenly identified himself as being of Asian descent by having a number of plastic surgeries. We cannot change who we are genetically and biologically. We are fearfully and wonderfully made, and that's great. That gives us security in our physical body. Just because you say that you are something doesn't make it so, and that's why keeping to these accurate interpretations of federal law, laws designed to protect what we call those immutable, unchangeable characteristics, are so incredibly important.
Well, and again, Sarah, you just referenced that wonderful scripture about God's sovereignty, fearfully and wonderfully made. And the reason why these issues, I think, are so important, and you and I have often talked about this, is that while there is a public policy aspect to this, you've talked about Title IX, Title VII, Bostock decision, all of that is legislative process, judicial decisions. But swirling around all of that is a person who is hurting, a person who is broken, a person who is confused. Our identity is found in Christ. I am crucified in Christ, and I no longer live, yet and our identity is in him. In Christ I live and move and have our being. All of those verses in Scripture that says, really, the joy of being able to come to Christ means we give up ourselves so that we can be completely indwelled by the person of Jesus Christ. Our identity is in him. When people are trying to identify as another sex, they're dealing on an outward appearance. 1 Samuel says that man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart. So this search for significance by simply altering through chemicals or surgery who you think you are really is a heart cry that must be heard and taken care of. When we come back, we're going to talk about schools in California and woke culture. Back after this. Sarah Parshall-Perry is a legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. Before that, former senior counsel to the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education. Sarah, I want to go to another piece that you wrote recently that talks about a school literally falling to woke culture by erasing its Catholic history. What happened in the state of California?
Well, California is really sort of left of left. In fact, its courts are left, its governor is left, but it's really done a number on public education. This time, they actually infected private education. Now, this is a school that was named after a Catholic saint, Saint Junipero Serra, And because of the sort of institution of woke culture and what we saw as the riots, what we've seen as critical race theory, what we've seen as Marxist infiltration, comprehensive sex education, education in America, period, is a mess. So in California, a high school principal decided she was going to capitalize on sort of the current culture of apologizing for your immutable characteristics, here we go again, and was going to take down the name of the actual school itself. Now, she did this in a very underhanded way. She referenced the criminal destruction of statues of Saint Sarah, this Catholic saint. He's known as the Apostle of California during the 2020 racial protests. And I think she believed that she thought she had sort of tapped into lightning in a bottle and that this would not be a problem. But the St. Thomas More Law Center does believe it was a problem. Here's why. She violated something called the Brown Act. And in California, that requires all public education meetings to be held open to the public. That's so that people can understand what's going to change. They have the opportunity to ask questions. Unfortunately, this principal decided she wasn't going to open the school board meeting to the public, nor would she give them an opportunity to talk about the fact that they wanted to keep the Saints name for the high school. So they, behind the scenes, changed the regulations. The school board worked together, didn't tell the population of the school itself, and promptly changed the name, which prompted the lawsuit by the Thomas More Law Center for violation of, among other things, California's Brown Act, the California Constitution, and the federal Constitution. This isn't just a woke issue because of immutable characteristics like race, and they had tried to paint this particular saint as a bigoted colonialist, notwithstanding the fact he actually did wonderful work with indigenous peoples and brought healing to the area. They also filed a claim under the Establishment Clause of the Constitution. She was expressing anti-religious hostility, not liking that this was a Catholic missionary whose name was attached to the school. So we have yet to see how the judge is going to rule, but we're encouraged by the fact that the San Diego Unified School District is now going to be held to account. They have to identify why they violated the Brown Act, why they violated the federal and state constitution, and we're hoping this is a wake-up call for other school administrators that they cannot state the rules simply because there is a current popular culture of wokeism in education.
I just opened the door to my little tent and a wind just blew in, okay? And so I'm trying to batten the hatches out here and see if I can get this. First of all, it's a Catholic school, so therefore it's a private school. So does the Brown Act in California apply to both public and private schools?
Yes, it does.
Okay. That's fact number one. Number two, she is the principal of said Catholic school, correct?
Yes, she is.
Okay, you write that she fomented anti-Catholic bigotry and claims of racism among her students. She's the captain of this team, and yet she's declaring her anti-Catholic bigotry as the principal of a Catholic school. My question is, forgive me for having a PhD in common sense, as my daddy used to say, why didn't this woman get fired early on? Because she's not serving the best interests of a Catholic school if she's arguing against Catholic ideologies, right? She would be hired, one would think. I mean, let me say it's a Christian school. It's tied to a Baptist church, right? So
Sure.
The principal of the school is fomenting anti-Baptist ideologies and wants to change the name. To me, the name change is a distant second to the fact that you're espousing thoughts that are antithetical to the profound doctrinal beliefs of that particular school. How'd she keep her job?
That's a great question. We're wondering the exact same thing. We know that the vote was rigged on changing the name of the school, that it happened without any public comment, without notifying the public, and so it looked very much like she had represented accurately what the student body and what the parents and taxpayers actually wanted, when in fact it was precisely the opposite. She'd sort of taken on this individual crusade to be able to show people that she was responding to a critical racial moment, and she wanted someone who was a bigoted colonialist not to be associated with
her interpretation. Her interpretation of the apostle. Okay,
of course.
Right,
yes.
of the apostle of California. Got it. Okay. So this was her idea of, look at me, I scored points because I bowed in acquiescence to the woke culture. But she was out of bounds because it looks like, for all appearances, that she allegedly has broken the Brown Act, didn't do it in public, didn't do it with the behest of the school board, didn't do it with input from parents and or students. And on top of that, by the way, is espousing anti-Catholic bigotry. I'm anxious to see not just what the judge says, but I'm anxious to see when the dust settles whether or not this woman keeps her job. Because if you don't believe in the principles and the precepts and the theology of a religious school of which you are the principal, I would say that, there's strong reason to believe you're just not the best captain of this team. So, wow, unbelievable. Sarah, I want to tell our friends that you can be followed on Twitter very, very easily. Give that address so people can follow.
You can go to @Sarah P. Perry. That's my handle on Twitter. Or you can go to heritage.org, search my name, and you'll find all the work that I do in this field.
And there is a ton of stuff, wide variety. In fact, I want you to know that there's about a half a dozen other articles that Sarah wrote that I did not get the time to discuss, but you can read them. So check it out, heritage.org. I've got a link on my website. And by the way, if you're interested in reading that piece about what happened in Louisiana, I've got a link directly on my website to that. So here's what you do. In the Market with JanetParshall.org, click on that red box. It says Program Details and Audio, takes you right over to the information page. There's a much longer bio for Sarah there. At the end of the bio, the link to Heritage, all kinds of issues there that you can peruse, both domestic and international. And on the right-hand side, the piece that she wrote about what's going on in the state of Louisiana. Sarah, thank you so much. Great conversation. I hope you've been encouraged. This program was designed this hour particularly to get you to think critically and to think biblically. And for the record, the two are not mutually exclusive. Thanks so much for joining us, friends. We'll see you next time on In the Market with Janet Parshall.